Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Story 1. Maura Murray was just 21 years old when she disappeared. A bright nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, she had a promising future ahead of her. But on February 9, 2004, something happened that would leave her family, friends, and eventually internet sleuths and true crime enthusiasts puzzled for years to come. What makes this case so intriguing is not just that Maura vanished, but the series of unusual events leading up to her disappearance and the many unanswered questions that still linger today. As we explore this case together, I invite you to breathe deeply and relax, letting your mind follow the gentle narrative while your body rests. Maura Murray was born on May 4, 1982, in Hanson, Massachusetts, a small town about 27 miles southeast of Boston. She was raised in a close-knit family with her parents Fred and Lori Murray, along with her siblings. Those who knew her described Maura as intelligent, athletic, and ambitious. Before attending UMass Amherst, Maura had spent time at the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point. She was a talented track star and excelled academically. However, after about a year and a half at West Point, she decided to transfer to UMass to pursue nursing instead. At UMass, Maura continued to thrive. She made the academic honor roll and worked as a security aide on campus to help pay for her education. She was in a long-term relationship with her high school boyfriend, Billy Roche, who was stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, serving in the U.S. Army at the time of her disappearance. By all accounts, Maura seemed to have a bright future ahead of her. She was scheduled to graduate soon with her nursing degree and had plans to continue her relationship with Billy. However, in the days and weeks leading up to her disappearance, there were signs that something might have been troubling her. In the fall of 2003, Maura was involved in a minor legal issue when she was caught using a stolen credit card number to order food. The charges were continued without a finding, meaning they would be dismissed after a probationary period if she stayed out of trouble. This incident was seemingly out of character for Maura, who generally maintained a good reputation. As January turned to February in 2004, several events occurred that, in retrospect, may provide clues to Maura's state of mind. On Thursday, February 5, just 4 days before her disappearance, Maura received a phone call while working her security job. A supervisor later reported that the call left Maura so distraught that she had to be escorted back to her dorm room. The content of this call has never been publicly confirmed. The weekend before her disappearance, Maura's father Fred came to visit her at school. They spent Saturday looking at cars, as Maura's current vehicle, a 1996 Saturn, was having problems. Fred agreed to help her purchase a new car the following week. On Saturday night, Maura borrowed her father's Toyota Corolla to attend a party with friends. While driving back to her father's hotel in the early hours of Sunday morning, she damaged his car in a single-vehicle accident. No other cars were involved, and Maura wasn't cited by police, but this added another stress to her life. On Monday, February 9, 2004, the day of her disappearance, Maura's actions suggest she was planning something. Though she attended classes that morning, she emailed her professors and work supervisor in the afternoon stating there had been a death in her family and she needed to go home to Hanson for the week. This was later discovered to be untrue. There had been no death in the Murray family. Around 3:30 p.m., Maura withdrew $280 from an ATM, nearly emptying her bank account. Security footage shows her alone at the bank. She then stopped at a liquor store and purchased about $40 worth of alcohol, including Bailey's Irish Cream, Kahlua, vodka, and a box of wine. These purchases were later found in her car. Before leaving the UMass campus, Maura packed up her belongings in her dorm room, including putting her textbooks away and laying her clothes out neatly on her bed. She left behind a personal note for her boyfriend Billy and packed a box of her belongings to mail to him. She also printed out directions to the Berkshires and Burlington, Vermont, though not to Hanson, where she had told her professors she was heading. What's also peculiar is that Maura hadn't told anyone, not her family, not her friends, not even her boyfriend, about her plans to leave campus. If she was indeed planning a trip or getaway, she kept it entirely to herself. By approximately 4:30 p.m., Maura was on the road in her Saturn, heading north. The last ping from her cell phone was recorded near Amherst at this time. After that, her phone either died or was turned off, as there were no further signals detected. As darkness fell on that cold February evening, Maura Murray was driving through the White Mountains of New Hampshire on Route 112, also known as the Kancamagus Highway, a winding, rural road that cuts through the White Mountain National Forest. This area is remote, with spotty cell service and houses spaced far apart. At approximately 7:27 p.m., Maura's car failed to navigate a sharp turn near Weathered Barn Road in Haverhill, New Hampshire. Her Saturn went off the road and into a snowbank, with the car pointing west on the eastbound side of the road. The front end was damaged, and the windshield was cracked where Maura's head may have struck it. The airbags had deployed. A local school bus driver named Butch Atwood was returning home from his route and spotted the disabled vehicle. He pulled his bus over and approached the car, finding a young woman he would later identify as Maura. According to Atwood, Maura had a small amount of blood on her face, likely from hitting the steering wheel or windshield. Atwood offered to call for help, but Maura declined, telling him she had already called AAA. This was strange because there was no cell service in that area. Atwood, concerned about the young woman in the cold, told her he was going to call for help anyway once he reached his house, which was only about 100 yards away. Atwood returned home at approximately 7:30 p.m. and called the police to report the accident. He then watched the scene from his window while waiting for authorities to arrive. At 7:46 p.m., a neighbor in the area called 911 to report seeing a car off the road. At approximately 7:56 p.m., police officer Cecil Smith arrived at the scene. However, when he got there, Maura Murray was nowhere to be found. Her car was locked, with some of her belongings still inside, including the alcohol she had purchased earlier that day. A rag had been stuffed into the tailpipe of her car, a technique sometimes used to stop a car from smoking excessively when the engine is damaged. Officer Smith searched the immediate area but found no footprints in the snow leading away from the car, though the ground was partially frozen and not entirely covered with snow. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of foul play, and no indication of where Maura might have gone. Between Atwood leaving the scene and Officer Smith arriving, a span of about 25 minutes, Maura Murray vanished. If she had walked away, she would have had to move quickly to get far enough away to avoid being seen by the responding officer. If someone had picked her up, they would have had a narrow window of opportunity. The question that has haunted investigators and Maura's family for years remains: where did Maura go, and why did she leave the scene of a relatively minor accident? The initial hours after Maura's disappearance were critical, though at first, authorities didn't treat her case as particularly urgent. Since she was an adult who may have simply walked away from an accident scene, possibly to avoid getting in trouble for driving under the influence, police initially classified her as a missing person rather than someone in danger. However, as night turned to day with no sign of Maura, concern grew. The temperature that night dropped to around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. If Maura had wandered into the woods or tried to walk for help, the cold posed a serious threat to her survival. By Tuesday, February 10th, the day after Maura's disappearance, a more organized search began. New Hampshire Fish and Game officers, along with state police and local authorities, began searching the area around the accident site. They used dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging, and ground teams to comb the nearby woods and roadways. The dogs were able to track Maura's scent for about 100 yards east along Route 112 from the accident site before losing it. This suggested she may have walked a short distance before getting into another vehicle, though this couldn't be confirmed. Searches continued throughout the week, expanding to cover a larger radius around the crash site. Teams checked abandoned buildings, drainage ditches, and the swift-moving Wild Ammonoosuc River that ran parallel to Route 112. No substantive clues were found. Meanwhile, Maura's family was only notified about her disappearance on Wednesday, February 11, 2 days after the accident. Her father Fred immediately drove to New Hampshire to assist in the search. He was joined by Maura's boyfriend Billy, who had been granted emergency leave from the army to help find her. As the days passed with no sign of Maura, her disappearance began to attract media attention. The circumstances were simply too strange to ignore. A young nursing student with no apparent reason to run away suddenly vanishes on a dark road in rural New Hampshire. Had she planned to disappear? Was she running from something? Or had something more sinister occurred? Investigators searched Maura's computer and found that she had looked up information about rental cabins in the White Mountains area. They also discovered she had called a rental property in Bartlett, New Hampshire, though there was no evidence she had actually made a reservation. As the official search efforts began to wind down after a week without results, Maura's family continued their own search. They distributed flyers throughout the region, talked to local residents, and pleaded for any information about their missing daughter and sister. As weeks turned into months with no sign of Maura Murray, several theories emerged about what might have happened to her on that cold February night. I'll share some of the main theories that investigators and amateur sleuths have explored over the years. The first and perhaps most straightforward theory is that Maura was planning to take a short break from her life stresses. Under this theory, she deliberately left campus planning to spend a few days in a cabin in the White Mountains, possibly to clear her head after the incidents of the previous weekend. After the accident, she may have accepted a ride from a passing motorist, intending to continue to her destination or return to Massachusetts, but unfortunately encountered someone with harmful intentions. A second theory suggests that Maura was intending to disappear permanently. Proponents of this theory point to the careful way she packed her dorm room and the fabricated story about a family death. Perhaps she had been planning a new life somewhere else and the accident was an unexpected complication. Under this theory, Maura may still be alive, living under a new identity. A third possibility is that Maura was disoriented after the accident, possibly from hitting her head on the windshield, and wandered into the woods where she succumbed to the elements. Although the search dogs didn't track her scent into the forest, the partially frozen ground could have made tracking difficult. The dense White Mountain National Forest has vast, remote areas where someone could become lost. Some theories focus on the tandem driver possibility. This suggests that Maura wasn't traveling alone but was being followed by someone in another vehicle. After the accident, she may have continued her journey with this person. This could explain why she refused help from Butch Atwood and why she disappeared so quickly from the scene. Over the years, various law enforcement agencies have continued to investigate Maura's case. The New Hampshire State Police, assisted at times by the FBI, have conducted searches of the area around the accident site, including some with ground-penetrating radar. In 2006, on the 2-year anniversary of Maura's disappearance, another search was conducted in the area, and again in 2008. In 2014, 10 years after Maura vanished, investigators used dogs trained to detect human remains to search a specific area of interest based on a tip. Nothing conclusive was found. The case has also attracted numerous amateur detectives and internet sleuths, leading to both helpful information gathering and, unfortunately, some unfounded accusations against local residents. Several podcasts and documentaries have been created about the case, including Oxygen's The Disappearance of Maura Murray and the independent podcast Missing Maura Murray. In the years since Maura's disappearance, there have been periodic developments in the case, though none have led to a definitive answer about what happened to her. In 2007, police searched a home near the accident site after a cadaver dog showed interest in the property. However, no evidence was found linking the location to Maura's disappearance. Fred Murray, Maura's father, has never stopped searching for his daughter. In 2019, after years of requesting access to a property near the crash site, he was finally able to conduct a search with ground-penetrating radar. This search identified disturbances in the ground that warranted further investigation. Shortly after, New Hampshire State Police conducted their own search of the property but reported finding no evidence related to Maura's case. Throughout the years, there have been reported sightings of Maura in various places, including Canada, but none have been confirmed. In 2017, bone fragments were found near the crash site, raising hopes of a resolution, but they were later determined not to be human. The New Hampshire State Police continue to classify this as an open missing persons case. They maintain that there is no evidence of foul play, though they haven't ruled it out either. The investigation remains active, with periodic reviews of evidence and follow-ups on new tips. For her family, especially her father Fred, the search continues. Every February, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a candlelight vigil is held near the site where her car was found. The blue ribbon, which has become a symbol of the search for Maura, can still be seen tied to trees in the area. As we come to the end of this perplexing case, the mystery of what happened to Maura Murray remains unsolved. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her vanished on a snowy road in New Hampshire, leaving behind questions that have lingered for over 2 decades. If you're still awake and listening, please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. In the vast expanse of the North Atlantic, approximately 20 miles west of Lewis in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, sits a cluster of small, uninhabited islands. The largest among them is Flannan Isle, also known as one of the Seven Hunters. In the late 1890s, the Northern Lighthouse Board constructed a lighthouse on Eilean Moor, the main island. Standing 75 feet tall, the lighthouse was built to warn ships away from the treacherous waters surrounding these remote islands. The area was notorious for fierce storms and dangerous currents that had claimed many vessels over the centuries. Unlike the automated lighthouses of today, the Flannan Isle lighthouse required constant human attention. 3 keepers would typically stay on the island for 2-week shifts, maintaining the light, keeping logs, and ensuring that ships passing through these dangerous waters would have a guiding beacon through the darkness. Life on the island was solitary and demanding. The keepers lived in a small cottage adjacent to the lighthouse tower. Their days followed strict routines of maintenance, observation, and record-keeping. The closest human contact was miles away on the mainland, and communication was limited to supply boats that would visit regularly, weather permitting. On December 7, 1900, 3 men began their shift at the lighthouse: James Duckett, the principal keeper with over 20 years of experience, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and Donald MacArthur, an occasional keeper who was substituting for the regular third man. These 3 seasoned lighthouse keepers were expected to remain on duty until December 21, when their relief would arrive. None of them would ever be seen again. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, was supposed to arrive at Flannan Isle on December 21, but bad weather delayed the supply vessel, the Hesperus, for several days. Captain Harvey, commanding the Hesperus, noted something unusual as they finally approached the island on December 26. The lighthouse was dark. No light shone from the tower that should have been guiding ships safely through these dangerous waters. The captain sounded the ship's whistle and sent up signal rockets, hoping to alert the keepers, but no response came from the island. Something was terribly wrong. When the Hesperus finally docked, Joseph Moore volunteered to investigate. He later described an overwhelming sense of dread as he climbed the steep path to the lighthouse. When he reached the main entrance, he found the gate closed and the door locked, just as they should be. But inside, an unsettling scene awaited him. The kitchen clock had stopped. A chair was overturned at the kitchen table, as if someone had risen in a hurry. In the kitchen, there were signs of a meal that had been prepared but never eaten. The lamps were cleaned and refilled with oil, ready for use. The lighthouse log entry stopped abruptly after December 15. The final entry read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." Most troubling of all, 2 sets of oilskins were missing, those belonging to Duckett and Marshall, but MacArthur's hung on its peg near the door. This suggested 2 men had gone outside, while 1 remained in the lighthouse. Yet all 3 had vanished without a trace. Moore and the crew of the Hesperus conducted a thorough search of the island. No bodies were found. No signs of struggle or violence were evident. The 3 men had simply disappeared into thin air. News of the mysterious disappearance quickly spread across Scotland and beyond. Robert Muirhead, a superintendent for the Northern Lighthouse Board who personally knew all 3 men, led the official investigation. He arrived at Flannan just days after the discovery and began meticulously documenting the scene and interviewing those who had first discovered the empty lighthouse. Muirhead's investigation revealed several important clues. First, he noted damage on the west landing of the island. A metal box had been broken open, its contents scattered. Iron railings were bent and twisted, and a rock weighing over a ton had been moved from its position. This damage suggested an extremely powerful storm had hit the western side of the island. The log entries from December 12 to 15 contained unusual notes about the weather. Thomas Marshall had written about severe winds the likes of which I have never seen. He also noted that James Duckett had been very quiet, and that the 3rd keeper, Donald MacArthur, had been crying. These observations were strange, as all 3 were experienced seamen accustomed to harsh conditions. Furthermore, weather reports from ships in the area didn't indicate any particularly severe storms during that period. The last entry in the log on December 15 reported that the storm had subsided and the sea was calm. Yet the damage Muirhead discovered suggested otherwise. Based on all the evidence available, Muirhead developed what would become the official theory. 2 of the keepers had gone out to secure equipment at the west landing during a sudden storm, and the 3rd rushed out to warn them or help them, leaving without his weatherproof clothing in his haste. All 3 were then swept away by an unexpected rogue wave. But not everyone was satisfied with this explanation. The locked doors, the stopped clock, the untouched meal, these details hinted at something perhaps more complex than a simple accident. As often happens with mysterious disappearances, alternative explanations soon emerged, ranging from the plausible to the fantastic. One theory suggested that one of the keepers murdered the other 2 before throwing himself into the sea. Mental breakdown was not uncommon among lighthouse keepers, who endured weeks of isolation in harsh conditions. The log entry about MacArthur crying and Duckett being unusually quiet could support this theory. However, there were no signs of violence found in the lighthouse, and all 3 men had good service records with no history of conflict. Another theory proposed that the men had been abducted by foreign spies or smugglers who might have been operating in the area. The early 1900s was a period of increasing international tensions, and remote locations were sometimes used for covert operations. Yet no suspicious vessels were reported in the area, and the lighthouse held nothing of strategic value that would interest foreign agents. Some local residents spoke of supernatural explanations. The islands had a folklore history rich with tales of sea monsters and malevolent spirits. Some claimed that strange lights had been seen around the island before and after the disappearance. One particularly persistent legend involved a phantom boat with ghostly figures that had been allegedly spotted near Flannan Isle throughout the centuries. A more scientific theory suggested that the men might have been poisoned by gases released from the volcanic rocks beneath the island, causing them to hallucinate or lose consciousness before falling into the sea. Geologists, however, found no evidence of such activity in the area. Perhaps most intriguing was the theory involving the Northern Lights. December 1900 saw an unusually strong display of aurora borealis in the region. Some researchers proposed that the keepers might have witnessed an exceptionally rare and powerful electromagnetic phenomenon associated with the aurora, which could explain the unusual log entries and might have somehow contributed to their disappearance. Modern analysts reviewing the case have focused on the meteorological evidence. Weather records confirm that while December 12 to 15 was not particularly stormy throughout the region, localized severe weather was entirely possible. The North Atlantic is notorious for its microclimate phenomena, where intense storm cells can develop and dissipate quickly, affecting very specific areas. Marine experts have pointed out that the west landing of Flannan Isle was particularly vulnerable to a phenomenon known as hydraulic lifting, where certain wave patterns can create enormous upward pressures capable of moving rocks and distorting metal structures, exactly the kind of damage observed on the island. In 2019, a team of oceanographers used computer modeling to simulate the wave patterns around Flannan Isle based on historical weather data. Their findings suggested that under certain conditions, waves reaching 100 feet in height could theoretically hit the western side of the island with little warning, powerful enough to sweep away anyone in their path. The psychological profiles of the three men have also been reassessed. Lighthouse keepers underwent rigorous screening for mental stability precisely because of the isolated and demanding nature of the job. All three had excellent service records, making theories involving violence between them seem less probable. The log entries remain perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the case. Why would experienced keepers like Marshall and Duckett express such alarm at storm conditions if they weren't exceptional? And what explained MacArthur's apparent emotional distress? Some historians have suggested the logs might have been embellished or even fabricated after the fact, though there's little concrete evidence for this. The Flannan Isle mystery has left an indelible mark on maritime history and popular culture. Poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson immortalized the disappearance in his 1912 ballad, Flannan Isle, with its haunting final stanza suggesting supernatural forces at work. The case has inspired countless books, documentaries, and even a 2018 film titled The Vanishing, starring Gerard Butler. In the decades following the incident, lighthouse operation changed dramatically. The Flannan Isle Lighthouse was one of the last to be automated in 1971, ending the era of manned lighthouses in Scotland. Today, it continues to shine its beam across the waters, now monitored remotely through modern technology. The island itself remains largely untouched, a windswept and desolate place that few visitors ever reach. Those who do make the journey often report an unsettling atmosphere, a sense of being watched. The original keeper's cottage stands empty, preserved almost exactly as it was when Joseph Moore discovered it on that December day in 1900. For the families of James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, closure never truly came. No bodies were ever recovered, leaving loved ones without even the comfort of a proper burial or memorial. Their descendants still occasionally visit the mainland shore facing Flannan Isle, gazing out toward the lighthouse that claimed their ancestors. As we conclude our journey through this haunting mystery, the disappearance of the Flannan Isle lighthouse keepers remains unsolved. Perhaps they were indeed victims of a rogue wave that struck with unexpected ferocity. Perhaps there's more to the story that we will never uncover. What makes this case so enduring is not just the mystery itself, but what it represents, the battle between human determination and the untamable power of nature. Three men stood vigil on a remote island, keeping ships safe from harm, only to vanish into the same dark waters they sought to protect others from. If you found tonight's story intriguing, please consider supporting our channel by liking this video and sharing it with friends who appreciate a good mystery before bedtime. Our community grows through your support, and it allows us to continue bringing you these atmospheric explorations of history's most perplexing cases. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 3. George and Jenny Sauter were living what many would consider the American dream. Italian immigrants who had built a successful life in their adopted country, they owned a trucking business that provided well for their family of 10 children in the small coal mining community of Fayetteville, West Virginia. George was known throughout the town as a hard-working, honest businessman. Standing 6 feet tall with a solid build, he had the physique of someone accustomed to manual labor. Though generally well-liked in the community, George was also known for his strong opinions, particularly regarding Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, whom he openly criticized, a stance that had reportedly earned him enemies among some of Fayetteville's Italian-American residents who supported the fascist leader. Jenny, George's wife, was described by those who knew her as a devoted mother whose life revolved around her children. Friends and neighbors recalled her exceptional cooking skills and the way she maintained an immaculate household despite having 10 children to care for. The Sodder home, a 2-story frame house located on a hillside just outside the main part of town, was always well kept and welcoming. Their children ranged in age from 2 to 23 years old. The oldest, John, was 23, followed by Marion, 17, and then George Jr., 16. The middle children were Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 10, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 6. The youngest were Sylvia, 3, and Tommy, 2. By all accounts, the Sodder children were bright, well-behaved, and happy. They performed well in school, helped with chores around the house, and were popular among their peers. As Christmas 1945 approached, the Sodder household buzzed with the typical excitement of the season. The family had decorated a Christmas tree in the living room, and the younger children had begged to stay up past their usual bedtime to play with their new toys. George and Jenny had relented, allowing the children to continue their activities while they retired to their bedroom. 5 of the middle children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, remained downstairs. The oldest sons, John and George Jr., were not at home that night. John was away serving in the military, and George Jr. was staying with friends. Marion, the oldest daughter, was working at a dime store in town for the holiday season. The 2 youngest children, Sylvia and Tommy, were already asleep in their parents' bedroom upstairs. No one could have predicted that this ordinary Christmas Eve would be the last time the Sodder family would be together, or that the events of that night would launch one of the most perplexing mysteries in American true crime history. At approximately 12:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, the telephone rang in the Sodder household, waking Jenny from her sleep. She rose to answer it, making her way downstairs through the quiet house. On the other end of the line was a woman asking for someone Jenny didn't know. In the background, Jenny could hear what sounded like laughter and glasses clinking, suggesting the caller was at a party. The woman apologized for the wrong number and hung up. As Jenny was about to return to bed, she noticed that the lights had been left on throughout the house, the doors were unlocked, and the curtains hadn't been drawn, all tasks typically completed before the family retired for the night. She assumed the children who had stayed up late had simply forgotten these regular evening routines. Jenny locked the doors, turned off the lights, and closed the curtains before returning upstairs. Just as she was drifting back to sleep around 1 a.m., Jenny was startled by a sound on the roof, a loud thump, followed by what she would later describe as a rolling noise. After listening for a moment and hearing nothing further, she dismissed it and fell back asleep. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Jenny was awakened once more, this time by the smell of smoke. She immediately roused her husband and they rushed from their bedroom to discover that a fire had started in one of the downstairs rooms. Flames were already spreading rapidly through the ground floor of the wooden house. George and Jenny grabbed their youngest children, Sylvia and Tommy, who had been sleeping in their room, and ran outside. Marion, who had returned from work and was sleeping in another upstairs bedroom, also managed to escape. George Jr. and John were not home, which meant 5 children were unaccounted for, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, all of whom had been sleeping in rooms on the first floor. George's first instinct was to re-enter the house to rescue his children, but when he opened the front door, he was met with a wall of flames. Undeterred, he ran to the window of the room where he believed the children were sleeping, intending to break it and enter that way. However, when he reached the side of the house, he found that he couldn't reach the windows without a ladder. Remembering the ladder that was always kept against the side of the house, George rushed to retrieve it, only to discover that it was mysteriously missing. In growing desperation, George then thought to drive one of his coal trucks up to the side of the house and climb onto its roof to reach the windows. To his horror, neither of his trucks would start, despite having worked perfectly fine just hours earlier. With no ladder and no functioning vehicles, George and Jenny began frantically calling out to their children, hoping they might have already escaped and were somewhere nearby in the darkness. The children did not respond. Neighbors, seeing the flames lighting up the night sky, began to arrive at the property, but by this time, the fire had engulfed most of the house. The family and their neighbors could only watch helplessly as the structure collapsed into the basement in less than 45 minutes, an unusually short time for a house fire, according to later expert testimonies. The fire department, located just 2.5 miles away in town, didn't arrive until 8 a.m., nearly 7 hours after the fire had started. Fire Chief F.J. Morris would later explain that the delay was due to the department's inability to reach the family by phone to verify the emergency and the driver's unfamiliarity with the location of the Sodder home. By the time firefighters arrived, the Sodder house had been reduced to a smoldering pile of ash. As the family stood in shock, watching the remains of their home still smoking in the cold December air, one devastating question consumed their thoughts: where were their 5 missing children? In the immediate aftermath of the fire, authorities began the grim task of searching through the ashes for remains of the 5 Sodder children. The search was conducted primarily by Fire Chief F.J. Morris and his team, who spent several hours carefully sifting through the debris. By the end of the day on Christmas, Morris delivered what appeared to be a conclusive, if tragic, finding: the children had perished in the fire, which was determined to have been caused by faulty wiring in the house's electrical system. The family was told that the children's bodies had been completely consumed by the intense heat of the fire, explaining why no remains were discovered. The county coroner's office issued death certificates for all 5 children on December 30th, just 5 days after the fire. The cause of death was listed as fire or suffocation, and with that, the case was officially closed. A funeral was held, and the community mourned alongside the devastated Sodder family. But for George and Jenny Sodder, the official explanation rang hollow. They began to question the findings almost immediately, troubled by several inconsistencies and unusual circumstances surrounding both the fire and the investigation. First and foremost was the issue of the missing remains. George, who had worked with coal for years, knew that even the hottest coal fire would leave behind bones. How could a house fire, regardless of its intensity, completely consume 5 human bodies without leaving any skeletal remains? This question became even more pertinent when they learned that other items from the house, including a refrigerator and George's favorite shotgun, had been found in the ashes relatively intact. Then there were the strange occurrences leading up to the fire. A life insurance salesman had visited the Sodder home months earlier and, after being turned down by George, had ominously warned, "Your house will go up in smoke, and your children will be destroyed." The man added that, "Your children are going to be destroyed," because of George's negative comments about Mussolini. Another man had been seen watching the Sodder children from his car as they returned home from school in the weeks before the fire. And just weeks before Christmas, a stranger had approached the house asking about hauling work, but instead of looking at George's trucks, he wandered to the back of the house, pointing out fuse boxes and warning that they could cause a fire someday. The Sodders also questioned why their phone line had been cut, not burned, but cut, on the night of the fire, preventing them from calling for help. And what explained the latter's disappearance, or why both trucks refused to start? These coincidences seemed too numerous and too convenient to be dismissed. Perhaps most troubling of all were the claims from several witnesses who reported seeing the missing Sodder children in the days and weeks following the fire. A woman who operated a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston claimed she had served breakfast to children matching their description on Christmas morning. The children were in the company of adults who wouldn't let them speak to anyone, she said. Another witness claimed to have seen 4 of the 5 children in a passing car while the fire was still burning. Armed with these inconsistencies and witness accounts, George and Jenny approached the authorities requesting that the investigation be reopened. Their pleas fell largely on deaf ears. The fire chief suggested that the family accept the tragedy and move on with their lives. The state police declined to get involved, deferring to the local authorities' findings. The FBI said they could only intervene if there was clear evidence of kidnapping, which local law enforcement insisted there was not. Frustrated but undeterred, the Sodders realized that if they wanted answers, they would have to find them themselves. In the spring of 1946, having received no support from official channels, George Sodder took an extraordinary step. He returned to the site of the fire, excavated the basement, and sifted through the soil himself, determined to find any evidence of his children's remains. What he discovered, or rather, what he didn't discover, only deepened his suspicions. After days of careful excavation, George found no trace of human remains whatsoever, no bones, no teeth, nothing to suggest that 5 children had perished in that spot. The absence of remains was so complete that it defied logical explanation, at least in the Sodders' minds. Seeking expert opinions, George contacted a crematorium to inquire about the temperature required to completely consume human bones. He was told that cremation occurs at temperatures between 1,600 and 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained for 2 hours or more. It seemed highly unlikely that a house fire, even one that consumed the structure quickly, could have reached and maintained such extreme temperatures. Around this same time, the Sodders began to compile a list of the strange occurrences before, during, and after the fire. 1. The threatening comments from the insurance salesman. 2. The stranger who had warned about the fuse boxes. 3. The man watching their children from his car. 4. The odd late-night wrong number call just before the fire. 5. The noise on the roof shortly before the fire was discovered. 6. The missing ladder. 7. Both trucks failing to start simultaneously. 8. The cut telephone line. 9. The fire department's inexplicable 7-hour delay. 10. The unusually fast-burning fire. 11. The multiple sightings of children resembling theirs after the fire. With this list in hand, the Sodders approached a pathologist from Washington, D.C., who confirmed what they suspected: it would be virtually impossible for a fire of that nature to leave no trace of human remains. This professional opinion convinced them even further that their children had not died in the fire but had instead been kidnapped. But why? And by whom? The Sodders began to develop theories based on George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini and the Italian government. Perhaps, they reasoned, their children had been targeted by supporters of the fascist regime in retaliation for George's political statements. It was a theory that gained some credibility given the threatening comments made by the insurance salesman and others about George's anti-Mussolini stance. In 1947, determined to find concrete answers, the Sodders took the unusual step of hiring a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, a former detective who had been recommended to them by a friend. Tinsley began his investigation by re-interviewing witnesses and reviewing the official findings, quickly discovering information that had been either overlooked or deliberately concealed by the original investigation. One of Tinsley's most significant discoveries came when he learned that Fire Chief Morris had claimed to have found a human heart in the ashes. Strangely, Morris had never mentioned this to the Sodders or included it in any official report. When confronted, Morris showed Tinsley a small box in which he kept what he claimed was a human organ. Tinsley, suspicious, sent the item to a forensic pathologist for analysis. The results were shocking. The heart was not human at all, but rather beef liver, fresh enough that it could not have been in the fire. This revelation suggested something far more disturbing than incompetence. It pointed to a deliberate attempt to mislead the family and close the case prematurely. Tinsley also uncovered that the insurance salesman who had threatened the family was a member of the coroner's jury that had ruled on the children's deaths. Armed with this new information, the Sodders intensified their efforts. They erected a billboard along Route 16 near their property, featuring photos of their 5 missing children along with an offer of a $5,000 reward for information leading to their recovery, a sum they later increased to $10,000. The billboard generated hundreds of tips and reported sightings from across the country, most of which led nowhere. But in August 1949, nearly 4 years after the fire, the Sodders received a photograph in the mail that reignited their hope and determination. The photograph showed a young man about 17 or 18 years old, with features strikingly similar to their son Louis, who would have been about that age by then. The photo had no return address, only a postmark from Kentucky and a handwritten note on the back that read, "Louis Sauter. I love brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35. The Sauters believed this was their son Louis, and that Frankie might refer to one of his brothers by a nickname. The cryptic numbers and letters remained a mystery. They immediately traveled to Kentucky to search for the sender and potentially their son, but their efforts there yielded no concrete results. Undeterred, the Sauters hired more investigators over the years and even reached out to the Italian government and the Vatican for help in determining if their children had perhaps been taken to Italy. They distributed flyers with age-progressed photographs of their missing children, maintained the billboard for decades, and continued to follow up on every lead, no matter how tenuous. George even excavated the site of the fire multiple times over the years, each time finding no evidence that his children had perished there. In 1949, 4 years after the fire, he brought in a team of expert excavators from Washington, D.C. for a more thorough examination of the site. This excavation yielded a disturbing discovery: several small fragments of human vertebrae. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The report from the Smithsonian was revealing. The vertebrae belonged to a single individual, approximately 14 to 15 years old. However, there was no evidence of exposure to fire, and the fragments showed cutting marks suggesting they had been cut by a surgical instrument. Most tellingly, the report concluded that the bones had only been in the ground for about 2 years, meaning they were placed there long after the fire had occurred. For the Sauters, this discovery only confirmed their suspicions of foul play and a cover-up. Someone had planted these bone fragments, perhaps in an attempt to bring closure to their tireless search. But who would do such a thing, and why? Over the decades following the fire, numerous theories emerged about what might have happened to the Sauter children. These ranged from the plausible to the far-fetched, but none has ever been conclusively proven or disproven. The kidnapping theory remained the Sauters' primary belief until their deaths. This theory held that the children were targeted, possibly due to George's anti-Mussolini sentiments, and were abducted by individuals with connections to Italy or to organized crime. The fire was set deliberately to cover up the kidnapping and to distract and delay any immediate search for the children. Supporting this theory were the many strange occurrences before and during the fire, the threatening comments, the cut phone line, the disabled trucks, and the missing ladder. Additionally, the multiple reported sightings of the children after the fire, the photograph allegedly showing Louis as a teenager, and the planted bone fragments all suggested that the children had survived the fire and were taken elsewhere. But if the children were kidnapped, what became of them? Some theorized that they were taken to Italy, possibly to be raised by relatives of their abductors or as part of some form of revenge against George for his political statements. Others suggested they might have been sold or given to childless couples in America who were willing to pay for children with no questions asked, not an uncommon practice in certain circles during that era. A darker variation of the kidnapping theory suggested involvement from local authorities or influential community members. This would explain the delayed response from the fire department, the hasty conclusion of the investigation, the planted beef liver, and the reluctance of officials to reopen the case despite mounting evidence of inconsistencies. But this theory never identified a clear motive for such a conspiracy. Another theory proposed that the children had escaped the fire but, for reasons unknown, chose to run away rather than return to their family. Perhaps they feared punishment for accidentally starting the fire, or perhaps they saw an opportunity for a fresh start elsewhere. However, this theory struggled to explain why 5 children ranging from 5 to 14 years old would choose to abandon their family and how they could have successfully remained hidden for decades. Some skeptics suggested that the children had indeed perished in the fire, and that the Sauters' refusal to accept this fact had led them to misinterpret evidence and see connections where none existed. These skeptics pointed to the phenomenon of confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs, and suggested that the Sauters' grief had clouded their judgment. This skeptical view, however, struggle to explain the complete absence of remains in the initial search and subsequent excavations, the planted bone fragments, and the numerous witness sightings. It also failed to account for the many unusual circumstances surrounding the fire. As the years passed, the case gained attention from journalists, authors, and amateur sleuths, each bringing their own perspectives and theories. One investigative journalist who looked into the case in the 1960s uncovered information about a potential local connection to organized crime, suggesting that the kidnapping might have been part of a broader criminal enterprise rather than specifically targeting the Sodders for George's political views. Another researcher in the 1970s proposed a theory involving child trafficking networks operating between West Virginia and Florida, noting that several of the reported sightings of the children came from Florida and nearby states. This researcher suggested that the children might have been taken by such a network, possibly with the complicity of corrupt local officials. In 1968, more than 2 decades after the fire, Jenny Sodder spotted a woman's face in a motel advertisement in a magazine that bore a striking resemblance to what she imagined her daughter Betty might look like as an adult. The woman in the ad had the same distinctive features as Betty: high cheekbones, dark eyes, and a particular smile that Jenny recognized immediately. The Sodders hired yet another private investigator to track down the woman, but once again, the lead went cold when the investigator disappeared after receiving an advance payment. One of the more intriguing developments came in the late 1970s, when a woman claiming to be Martha Sodder contacted the family. According to this woman, Martha had been taken to an orphanage in St. Petersburg, Florida, immediately after the fire and was later adopted by a wealthy Florida family. The woman provided specific details about the Sodder family that weren't widely known, adding credibility to her claim. However, before a meeting could be arranged to verify her identity, contact with the woman ceased, and attempts to locate her proved unsuccessful. Throughout these decades of searching, George and Jenny Sodder never wavered in their belief that their children were alive. They maintained the billboard along Route 16 until George's death in 1969. Jenny continued to wear black in mourning and maintained a room in their new home with gifts for the children's return until her own death in 1989. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Sodders' search was that they never sought punishment for those they believed responsible for taking their children. In interviews, they repeatedly stated that they simply wanted to know what happened and to be reunited with their children if possible. George was known to say that he would forgive whoever took his children if they would just let him see them one more time. Today, more than 75 years after the fire, the case of the missing Sodder children remains officially unsolved. The original participants in the story, George and Jenny Sodder, Fire Chief Morris, Investigator C.C. Tinsley, and many others, have long since passed away, taking whatever knowledge they had to their graves. The surviving Sodder children, Sylvia, who was just 2 at the time of the fire, and her older siblings who weren't home that night, continued the search for decades after their parents' deaths. They granted interviews, maintained contact with investigators interested in the case, and preserved the detailed records their parents had accumulated over years of searching. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest Sodder child who survived the fire, has been particularly vocal about keeping the case in the public eye. Now in her late 70s, she has stated in interviews that she still believes her siblings survived the fire and were taken for reasons unknown. "I think there was a kidnapping," she told one reporter in a 2013 interview. "I don't think the fire was an accident." The case has garnered renewed interest in recent years through podcasts, documentaries, and online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Amateur sleuths continue to develop theories and search for connections, though no breakthrough has emerged that would definitively solve the case. In 2013, the state of West Virginia erected a historical marker near the site of the fire, commemorating what has become one of the state's most enduring mysteries. The marker reads, in part, "On Christmas Eve, 1945, a fire destroyed the home of George and Jenny Sodder. 4 of their 9 children escaped. The bodies of the other 5 were never found, despite an extensive search. The cause of the fire and the fate of the 5 Sodder children remain a mystery." The site of the Sodder home itself has long since been reclaimed by nature, with trees and undergrowth covering what was once the basement of their two-story house. The billboard that stood for decades along Route 16 is gone, though photographs of it remain as a testament to one family's unyielding determination to find the truth. What makes the Sodder children case so compelling and heartbreaking is not just the mysterious circumstances surrounding the fire, but the unwavering dedication of George and Jenny Sodder in their search for answers. They never gave up hope that their children were alive, and they never stopped looking for them, despite official indifference, dead ends, and the passage of time. For those who study the case today, the questions remain as puzzling as ever. Did the 5 Sodder children perish in the fire, somehow leaving no traces behind? Were they kidnapped as part of some complex plot related to George's political views or other unknown factors? Was there a cover-up involving local authorities? And what are we to make of the numerous reported sightings, the photograph of the young man resembling Lewis, and the planted bone fragments? Perhaps most haunting of all is the question of what became of Maurice, Martha, Lewis, Jenny, and Betty if they did survive the fire. Did they grow up under different names, perhaps never knowing their true identities? Did they live full lives elsewhere, maybe even having families of their own? Or did they meet some other fate, their true story lost to time? Without new evidence or a deathbed confession from someone involved, it seems unlikely that we will ever know with certainty what happened on that Christmas Eve in 1945. The Sodder children mystery joins the ranks of other enduring American enigmas, cases where the truth seems just out of reach, tantalizing us with clues and possibilities but never revealing its full self. Yet the story lives on, not just as a mystery to be solved, but as a testament to the depth of parental love and the human need for closure and truth. George and Jenny Sodder never found the answers they sought, but their refusal to accept convenient explanations and their determination to keep searching has ensured that their children will not be forgotten. And perhaps somewhere, someone still living holds the key to unraveling the mystery, a person who knows what really happened to the 5 Sodder children who vanished into the cold West Virginia night on Christmas Eve, 1945. As we reach the end of our journey through this haunting mystery, I hope you found this exploration of the Sodder children case as fascinating as I have. True crime stories like these remind us that behind every unsolved case are real people whose lives were forever changed by events that defied explanation. The Sodder family's story is particularly powerful because it speaks to universal themes: the love of parents for their children, the human need for answers and closure, and the sometimes insurmountable barriers we face in our quest for truth. If you're still awake and enjoying this narration, I want to thank you for spending this time with me exploring one of America's most perplexing family mysteries. If you've drifted off to sleep, as many of our listeners do, then I hope this story has provided a gentle transition into your dreams. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 4. Boston in 1990 was a city of contrasts. Historic cobblestone streets wove between modern skyscrapers. The city was experiencing urban renewal after difficult decades, with the Big Dig infrastructure project just beginning to transform downtown. In the Fenway Kenmore neighborhood stood a building that seemed out of place and time, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Unlike the sleek Museum of Fine Arts nearby, the Gardner Museum was housed in a building designed to resemble a 15th-century Venetian palace, complete with an interior courtyard garden filled with seasonal flowers and ancient statuary. 4 stories tall with a glass roof allowing natural light to flood the central garden, the museum stood as a testament to one remarkable woman's vision. Isabella Stewart Gardner herself was quite a character in Boston society. Born in 1840 to wealthy New York parents, she married John Lowell Gardner, a successful Boston businessman, in 1860. After the tragic death of their only son at just 2 years old, Isabella fell into depression. Her husband took her traveling through Europe, Asia, and the Middle East to help her recover. These journeys sparked her passion for art and culture. By the 1890s, Isabella had become an avid and discerning collector. She worked with important art dealer Bernard Berenson to acquire masterpieces from European nobles and collectors who had fallen on hard times. Unlike many collectors of her era, Isabella had her own distinct vision. She didn't simply want to amass precious objects, she wanted to create an experience, an atmosphere where art could be appreciated in a personal, intimate setting. The museum officially opened in 1903 with a grand celebration. Isabella had apartments on the 4th floor where she lived until her death in 1924. Her will contained strict conditions. Nothing in the museum's galleries could be permanently moved or changed, no artwork could be bought or sold, and the rooms must remain precisely as she had arranged them. This unusual stipulation would later make the theft we're about to discuss all the more poignant, as empty frames would hang exactly where she had placed the paintings, a silent testament to what was missing. The museum contained over 2,500 objects, paintings, sculptures, tapestries, furniture, manuscripts, rare books, and decorative arts. Among its treasures were works by Titian, Raphael, Botticelli, and one of the largest collections of John Singer Sargent paintings in the world. But perhaps most precious were Rembrandt's only known seascape, The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, and one of only 34 known paintings by Johannes Vermeer, The Concert. These irreplaceable treasures were protected by what seemed, at the time, adequate security measures. The museum had alarm systems on the windows and doors, motion detectors in the galleries, and security guards patrolling around the clock. However, as we would come to learn, this security system had significant vulnerabilities. Let's set the scene for the night of March 17, 1990. It was St. Patrick's Day in Boston, a city with deep Irish roots. Downtown was alive with celebrations. Bars and restaurants overflowed with patrons wearing green, singing traditional Irish songs, and raising glasses of Guinness. The annual parade had wound through South Boston earlier that day, and the festivities continued well into the night. Meanwhile, in the quieter Fenway Kenmore neighborhood, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum had closed its doors at 5 p.m. after a typical day of art enthusiasts and tourists wandering its galleries. The daytime security staff had completed their shifts, and the night guards were taking over. Richard Abath, a 23-year-old music student and part-time security guard, arrived for his overnight shift. Tall with curly hair and an easygoing demeanor, Abath was more passionate about his rock band than museum security. His fellow guard that night was Randy Heston, 25, who was relatively new to the job. Neither man expected anything unusual on this quiet Sunday night. The museum's security protocols required 2 guards on duty overnight. They were supposed to patrol the galleries separately at regularly scheduled intervals, keeping in radio contact. One guard was meant to remain at the security desk at all times, monitoring the alarm systems. As the museum settled into its nighttime routine, the galleries fell silent. The only sounds were the occasional footsteps of the guards making their rounds, the gentle hum of the climate control system maintaining the precise temperature and humidity required for the preservation of centuries-old artwork, and perhaps the distant sounds of St. Patrick's Day revelry carried on the cool March air. Outside, the weather was clear and cool, around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, a typical early spring night in New England. The neighborhood was relatively quiet, with most of the St. Patrick's Day celebrations concentrated downtown rather than in this residential and cultural area. By midnight, most of the nearby establishments had closed or were closing. The bars of Lansdowne Street near Fenway Park had begun to empty. Students from nearby universities like Northeastern, Boston University, and the Berklee College of Music were making their way back to dormitories and apartments. Inside the museum, Abath sat at the security desk in the museum's basement while Heston made his rounds through the galleries above. The night had been uneventful so far. Perhaps Abath was thinking about his band's next gig, or Heston was contemplating the artwork surrounding him as he patrolled the quiet halls. Little did they know that this ordinary night was about to become extraordinary, and they would find themselves unwitting participants in what would become one of the most infamous art heists in history. The digital clock on the security desk read 1:24 a.m. when the buzzer sounded, breaking the quiet of the early morning hours. Richard Abath looked up at the small video monitor that showed the museum's side entrance on Palace Road. In the grainy black and white footage, he could make out 2 figures in what appeared to be police uniforms. Abath pressed the intercom button. "Can I help you?" "Police. We're responding to a report of a disturbance on the premises," came the reply. Abath hesitated. There had been no disturbance that he was aware of. However, the men outside were wearing what looked like legitimate Boston Police Department uniforms, complete with hats and badges. "We received a call about a possible intruder in the courtyard," one of the officers added. "We need to check it out." The museum's policy was clear: no one was to be admitted after hours without prior authorization. But these were police officers responding to a potential security threat at the museum itself. After a moment's consideration, Abath buzzed them in, violating protocol but believing he was cooperating with law enforcement. The two uniformed men entered the small vestibule and then stepped into the security room. They asked for identification, and Abath complied, showing them his driver's license. One officer looked at it closely and then made an unexpected comment. "Looks like there's a warrant out for your arrest. Step out from behind the desk, please." Confused and alarmed, Abath did as he was told. As he moved away from the desk, the second officer said something that changed everything. "Gentlemen, this is a robbery." In that moment, Abath realized his terrible mistake. These weren't police officers at all. The police uniforms were convincing but not authentic. The badges were duplicates, not official Boston police badges. The mustaches the men wore were fake. "Don't give us any problems, and you won't get hurt," one thief said calmly. They asked if anyone else was in the building, and Abath told them about Randy Heston, who was still making his rounds in the galleries. They instructed Abath to call Heston on the radio, telling him to come down to the security desk. Unaware of what was happening, Heston responded to the call. When Heston arrived, he too was quickly subdued. The thieves used handcuffs to restrain both guards, securing their hands and ankles. They used duct tape to cover the guards' eyes and mouths, then led them to the basement mechanical room, where they handcuffed them to pipes on opposite sides of the room. "If you cooperate, you'll be fine," one thief assured them. "We're not interested in you. We're here for the art." One of the thieves asked Abath, "How often do they come by to check on you?" Abath explained that no one would be coming until the morning shift arrived at 7 a.m. The thieves now had nearly 6 hours to carry out their plan. "Don't worry," one of the thieves said before leaving the guards. "This will be over by morning, and you'll have quite a story to tell." With the guards secured, the thieves were now free to move throughout the museum. The building's security system had motion detectors in the galleries and magnetic contacts on the windows and doors, but no cameras recorded the thieves' movements once they left the security desk area. The alarm system that would normally alert police directly had been disabled as soon as they gained control of the security desk. In the quiet of the early morning, with rain beginning to fall gently outside, the pair set about their real purpose: the systematic theft of some of the world's most precious artwork. What happened next revealed that this was no ordinary smash-and-grab robbery. The thieves moved through the museum with what investigators would later describe as astonishing precision and knowledge. Their actions suggested they were working from a predetermined plan, targeting specific pieces while ignoring others of equal or greater value. The thieves began on the second floor in the Dutch Room, home to some of the museum's most valuable paintings. Their first target was Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, 1633, the artist's only known seascape. The 4-by-3-foot canvas depicted Jesus and his disciples in a small boat, battling a furious storm on the Sea of Galilee. The painting captured the moment described in the Gospels when Jesus calmed the waters, showing both the terror of the disciples and the dramatic play of light on the turbulent waves. Rather than carefully removing the painting, the thieves roughly cut it from its frame with a sharp blade, leaving jagged edges of canvas behind. Art experts would later lament that this crude removal technique had potentially damaged the masterpiece beyond repair. Just a few feet away hung another Rembrandt, A Lady and Gentleman in Black, 1633, a striking double portrait showcasing the artist's masterful ability to convey the social status and personality of his subjects through their clothing, posture, and expressions. This too was cut from its frame. Perhaps most valuable of all their targets was Johannes Vermeer's The Concert, 1658 to 1660, one of only 34 known paintings by the Dutch master. The intimate scene showed two women and a man performing music in a richly appointed interior. Vermeer's famous mastery of light illuminated the scene, with sunlight filtering through a window to highlight the performers. This painting alone was valued at over $200 million in today's terms. Again, the thieves cut it roughly from its frame. Next came one of the strangest aspects of the heist. The thieves took the time to remove a relatively small Rembrandt self-portrait etching from its frame. However, they left behind Rembrandt's famous self-portrait, age 23, which hung nearby and was arguably more valuable. This selective targeting puzzled investigators for years afterward. Moving to another gallery, they took Edgar Degas' La Sortie de Passage, a pencil and watercolor sketch showing racetrack scenes. In fact, they took 5 Degas sketches in total, all relatively small works that would have been easy to transport. In the short gallery, they removed Edouard Manet's Chez Tortoni, a painting showing a man in a top hat writing at a café table. This painting was unusual among the stolen works because its empty frame was later found on the security director's chair in the security office, suggesting the thieves had spent time in that room as well. Not all their targets were paintings. From the Blue Room, they took an ancient Chinese bronze vessel from the Shang dynasty. From a cabinet in the Dutch Room, they removed a finial in the form of an eagle that had once adorned a Napoleonic flag. Perhaps most bizarrely, from the Tapestry Room, they attempted to remove a flag from the Napoleonic era but struggled with its mount. Eventually, they left it behind. Throughout their methodical journey through the museum, the thieves bypassed works of tremendous value. They walked past paintings by Michelangelo, Raphael, and Botticelli. They ignored valuable jewelry and jade artifacts. They left behind the museum's famous Titian painting, The Rape of Europa, considered the most valuable painting in New England. This selectivity has led many investigators to believe the thieves were working from a shopping list, possibly provided by a collector who had commissioned the theft for specific desired works. In total, the thieves spent 81 minutes inside the museum. They moved deliberately from room to room, taking their time to select and remove their targets. There was no evidence of rushing or panic, despite the enormity of their crime. By 2:45 a.m., they had gathered 13 works of art with a combined value that would eventually be estimated at over $500 million. The greatest art heist in history was nearly complete. All that remained was their escape. The hours passed slowly for Richard Abath and Randy Heston in the basement. Uncomfortable and anxious, they remained handcuffed to pipes, unable to see through their duct-taped eyes or call for help through their taped mouths. They had no way of knowing if the thieves were still in the building or what was happening in the galleries above them. At approximately 8:15 a.m., the morning security shift arrived. Finding no one at the security desk, they began searching the museum. When they discovered the 2 night guards in the basement, they immediately called the police. Within minutes, Boston Police Department officers arrived at the scene. As the police freed Abath and Heston, museum staff made the horrifying discovery upstairs. Empty frames hung on the walls where masterpieces had been displayed for decades. Broken glass and fragments of gilded frames littered the floors of several galleries. The full extent of the theft began to emerge. And Hawley, the museum's director, had only been in her position for 6 months. She arrived shortly after the police, walking through the galleries with increasing dismay as the scope of the loss became clear. Later that day, ashen-faced and visibly shaken, she would face the press. "This is devastating for Boston and the entire art world," she told the assembled reporters. "These works are irreplaceable. They represent our shared cultural heritage." The Boston Police Department immediately established a perimeter around the museum and began processing the crime scene. Detectives interviewed the guards and museum staff while evidence technicians dusted for fingerprints and collected any potential physical evidence. By midday, the FBI had joined the investigation. Special Agent Dick Teahan from the FBI's Boston office took charge of the federal response. Art theft of this magnitude fell under federal jurisdiction, and the FBI had specialists trained to handle such cases. "We're treating this as our highest priority," Teahan told the press. "We've activated our art crime team and are coordinating with Interpol and other international agencies. We will pursue every lead until these treasures are recovered." News of the heist spread quickly through the art world. Museum directors and curators across the globe expressed their shock and solidarity. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York issued a statement calling the theft an attack on our collective cultural memory. Meanwhile, the museum's trustees gathered for an emergency meeting. The question of insurance loomed large. Ironically, many of the stolen pieces were not insured. Isabella Stewart Gardner's will had severely restricted the museum's finances, and comprehensive insurance for the entire collection had been deemed too expensive. This made the recovery of the actual artwork even more crucial. By the end of that first day, the museum announced a $1 million reward for information leading to the recovery of the artwork. This would later be increased to $5 million, and eventually to $10 million, the largest private reward ever offered for stolen property. As night fell on that first day, the rain that had begun during the early morning hours continued to fall on Boston. Inside the museum, empty frames hung on the walls, a decision made by the museum's leadership to honor Isabella Stewart Gardner's wishes that nothing be moved from its original location, and as a poignant reminder of what had been lost. These empty frames would become powerful symbols in the coming years, rectangular voids where masterpieces had once hung, silent witnesses to an unsolved crime. In the days following the heist, a massive investigation swung into action. The FBI took the lead, working closely with Boston police and international law enforcement agencies. Their first focus was on the security guards, particularly Richard Abath, who had broken protocol by admitting the fake police officers. Abath was subjected to intense questioning and multiple polygraph tests. While some suspicion lingered, particularly when investigators discovered that alarm data showed Abath had opened the side door briefly, then reopened it 1 minute later to admit the thieves, no evidence directly implicated him in the planning of the heist. "I made a mistake letting them in," Abath told investigators. "I've replayed that moment 1,000 times in my mind. But I was not involved in this theft." Investigators next turned to the method of the robbery. The thieves had displayed intimate knowledge of the museum's layout and security systems. They had known exactly which galleries to visit and which pieces to take. This suggested either inside information or careful reconnaissance prior to the heist. Museum employees, contractors, and frequent visitors were interviewed. Security logs from the weeks preceding the theft were scrutinized for any unusual visitors or behavior. Former employees were contacted and questioned. Another early theory focused on organized crime. Boston in 1990 was still very much under the influence of various criminal organizations. The Irish mob, led by notorious gangster Whitey Bulger, controlled much of South Boston. The Italian mafia maintained strongholds in the North End and in nearby Providence, Rhode Island. FBI agents with connections to informants in these organizations began asking questions. Had anyone been boasting about a big score? Was there talk of valuable paintings available on the black market? These inquiries led to numerous tips but no concrete evidence. One particularly promising lead emerged from art thief Miles Connor Jr., who was in prison at the time of the Gardner heist. Connor had a history of museum thefts in New England and had once stolen a Rembrandt from the Museum of Fine Arts, later returning it in exchange for reduced prison time. Connor claimed he could help recover the Gardner paintings in exchange for his release and the reward money. However, when pressed for details, his information proved vague and ultimately unhelpful. The international dimension of the investigation expanded rapidly. Art theft experts knew that stolen masterpieces often cross borders quickly after a major heist. Interpol issued alerts, and customs officials worldwide were provided with descriptions and images of the stolen works. Particular attention was paid to Ireland, given both the timing of the theft on St. Patrick's Day and rumors of connections to the Irish Republican Army, which had allegedly used art theft as a fundraising method in the past. Similarly, investigators looked into possible connections to organized crime groups in France, Italy, and Eastern Europe, all of which had histories of art theft. Despite casting this wide net, no credible sightings of the artwork emerged. Unlike many high-profile art thefts, no ransom demands were made to the museum. The thieves had simply vanished, along with their priceless haul. By the end of the first year, investigators had conducted hundreds of interviews, followed up on thousands of tips, and explored dozens of theories. They had exactly 0 arrests and had recovered none of the artwork. The rain continued to fall outside the museum, washing away any lingering physical evidence, while inside, the empty frames remained, a daily reminder of an unsolved mystery that was quickly becoming one of Boston's most enduring criminal legends. As years passed, the Gardner Museum heist investigation continued, though with decreasing intensity as more immediate cases demanded attention. However, periodic breaks in the case would reignite interest and effort. In 1994, an anonymous letter was sent to the museum. The writer claimed to be an intermediary who could negotiate the return of the paintings for $2.6 million and immunity from prosecution. The museum, working with the FBI, initiated contact through newspaper advertisements as the letter instructed. After a promising start to negotiations, the purported intermediary stopped communicating, and this lead, like so many others, evaporated. That same year, art investigator Harold Smith, who had been hired by the museum's insurance company, began focusing on Boston gangster Carmelo Merlino, who ran an auto repair shop in Dorchester. Smith developed informants who claimed Merlino had access to the paintings and was looking for buyers. The FBI set up a sting operation, but before it could be executed, Smith died of blood cancer, and the lead grew cold. By the late 1990s, a new theory emerged focusing on Connecticut mobster Robert Gentile. FBI agents received information that Gentile had been given the paintings by a Boston criminal associate, Robert Guarente, shortly before Guarente's death in 2004. When agents searched Gentile's home in 2012, they found a handwritten list of the stolen paintings and their estimated values, but no artwork. "I've never seen those paintings," Gentile insisted during questioning. "If I had $500 million in paintings, would I be living like this?" Despite repeated raids on his properties and the offering of reduced sentences for other crimes in exchange for information about the Gardner art, Gentile maintained his denial until his death in 2021. Another compelling theory centered on Boston criminal David Turner. In 1992, Turner and his associate Stephen Rossetti had planned to rob an armored car depot with Carmelo Merlino. The FBI arrested them before they could carry out this robbery, and some agents believed the planned robbery was actually an attempt to generate money to buy back the Gardner paintings to then return them for the reward. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, the investigation continued to focus on these Boston-area criminal connections. FBI agents became convinced that the artwork had never left Boston, and that knowledge of its whereabouts had passed through a succession of local criminals, many of whom were now dead. In 2013, the FBI held a press conference announcing they were confident they had identified the thieves, local criminals who were now deceased. However, they believed the artwork had changed hands and might still be recoverable. They increased the reward to $10 million and appealed directly to anyone who might have seen the paintings, even unknowingly. "At this point, our focus is not on prosecution but on recovery," FBI Special Agent Jeff Kelly stated. "We just want these treasures returned to where they belong." This announcement led to a flurry of new tips, but again, no concrete evidence emerged. Some art crime experts criticized the FBI's approach, suggesting that publicly identifying the thieves as local criminals without recovering the art might drive the current holders to destroy the evidence. Another intriguing theory emerged around the same time. Some investigators began to wonder if the heist was connected to the troubles in Northern Ireland. James "Whitey" Bulger, the notorious Boston gangster, had connections to the Irish Republican Army and had been involved in shipping weapons to the organization. Could the theft have been organized to provide funding or leverage for the IRA? Bulger himself was captured in 2011 after 16 years as a fugitive, but he denied any knowledge of the Gardner theft before his murder in prison in 2018. As the decades passed, the case became more challenging. Key suspects died, memories faded, and evidence deteriorated. Yet public fascination with the case only grew. Books, documentaries, and podcasts about the heist appeared regularly. Amateur sleuths developed their own theories and conducted their own investigations. For the museum staff and art lovers worldwide, the empty frames that still hung on the walls of the Gardner Museum served as a constant reminder of the loss. Isabella Stewart Gardner's will had specified that nothing in the museum could be moved or changed. Ironically, this meant that the empty frames must remain in place, silent witnesses to the crime. The rain fell through the seasons and the years, while inside the museum, visitors gazed at empty frames and wondered where the masterpieces might be, rolled up in an attic, hidden in a storage unit, or perhaps hanging on the wall of some secretive collector, appreciated by only one pair of eyes instead of by the world. Today, more than 3 decades after the theft, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist remains the largest unsolved art theft in history. The FBI case remains open, though many of the original investigators have retired or passed away. The investigation has been handed down to a new generation of agents who continue to follow up on tips and develop new leads. The museum itself has changed in some ways while remaining steadfastly committed to its mission. In 2012, the Gardner Museum opened a new wing designed by acclaimed architect Renzo Piano, providing additional gallery space, a concert hall, and educational facilities. Yet the original palace building remains largely as Isabella Stewart Gardner left it, including those haunting empty frames. Current museum director Peggy Fogelman continues the tradition established by her predecessors of keeping public attention on the missing artwork. On the anniversary of the theft each year, the museum holds events highlighting the stolen pieces and their significance. These works aren't just valuable objects, Fogelman explained in a recent interview. They are irreplaceable cultural treasures that belong to all of us. We remain hopeful that they will one day return to these walls. The $10 million reward remains available, with no expiration date. Museum officials emphasize that they are interested only in the safe return of the artwork, not in prosecution. The statute of limitations on the theft itself has long expired, though charges related to possession of the stolen artwork could still be brought. The FBI maintains a dedicated page on its website with images and descriptions of the stolen artwork. They receive several tips each month, though the quality and credibility of these leads have diminished over time. Art recovery experts now fear that the artwork may have been destroyed or damaged due to improper storage. Oil paintings require specific environmental conditions to prevent deterioration. If the thieves or subsequent holders of the artwork were not aware of these requirements, the masterpieces could have suffered significant damage. Other experts maintain hope that the paintings are intact and will eventually resurface. They point to other famous art thefts where paintings were recovered decades after their disappearance. In 2019, a Gustav Klimt painting stolen from an Italian gallery in 1997 was found hidden in a wall of the same gallery, 22 years later. Perhaps, they suggest, the Gardner treasures are similarly waiting to be found. For those who remember visiting the Gardner Museum before the theft, the memory of seeing Rembrandt's seascape or Vermeer's concert scene in person remains precious. For younger visitors who have only ever seen the empty frames, the absence creates its own powerful impression, a testament to the enduring impact of art and the void created when it is taken from public view. Tonight, as the rain falls gently in our background, the mystery of the Gardner Museum heist remains unsolved. Somewhere, perhaps, the storm on the Sea of Galilee still exists, its painted waves forever frozen in motion while Jesus calms the waters. Somewhere, the lady and gentleman in black still gaze out from Rembrandt's canvas. Somewhere, Vermeer's musicians are still caught in the middle of their eternal concert. The empty frames still hang on the walls of the Gardner Museum, waiting for their treasures to return. Perhaps someday, the 13 missing masterpieces will find their way home. Until then, let the sound of the rain guide you into peaceful sleep, carrying with it the echoes of one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Story 5. November 24, 1971, was a typical late autumn day in the Pacific Northwest. The region had been experiencing its characteristic rainfall, with clouds hanging low over the densely forested mountains that dominate the landscape between Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. The temperature hovered in the mid-40s Fahrenheit, chilly but not yet the deep cold of winter. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and Portland International Airport was busy with holiday travelers. Families reunited, college students returned home for the break, and business travelers hurried to reach their destinations before the holiday. Among these ordinary travelers, a man arrived at the airport, distinguishable only in retrospect. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall with an olive complexion. He wore a dark suit with a white shirt, a narrow black tie, and a mother-of-pearl tie pin. He had on a black or dark brown overcoat and carried a briefcase. To anyone who noticed him, he looked like a typical businessman of the era, conservative, unremarkable, just another face in the crowd of travelers. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, this man approached the Northwest Orient Airlines counter. When he reached the front of the line, he spoke with the ticket agent, a young woman named Tina Mucklow. "I'd like a one-way ticket to Seattle," he said in a low, pleasant voice. "Will that be coach or first class, sir?" Mucklow asked. "Coach is fine," he replied, paying the $18.52 fare in cash. The man gave his name as Dan Cooper, though he would later become known to the world as D.B. Cooper, due to a media error that was never corrected. He received his ticket for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a short 30-minute hop from Portland to Seattle. At 3 p.m., the passengers for Flight 305 began boarding the Boeing 727-100 aircraft. The plane was only about one-third full, not unusual for a short domestic flight on the day before a major holiday. Cooper took his seat in 18C, near the back of the aircraft in the smoking section. He lit a cigarette and ordered a bourbon and soda before the plane had even taken off. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 3:07 p.m., 7 minutes behind schedule. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Cooper remained quiet, smoking his cigarette and sipping his drink. Flight attendant Florence Schaffner would later recall that he seemed pleasant but kept to himself, a detail that would have been entirely forgettable on any other day. At 3:15 p.m., the Boeing 727 lifted off from Portland International Airport, climbing through the rainy skies toward Seattle. The flight was scheduled to take just 36 minutes from takeoff to landing. For the other passengers and crew, it seemed like it would be an entirely ordinary journey. Shortly after takeoff, as the plane reached its cruising altitude, Cooper signaled to Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant nearest to him. When she approached, he handed her a folded note. Schaffner took the note and placed it in her pocket without reading it, assuming it contained the phone number of a lonely businessman hoping for a date, something flight attendants of that era experienced frequently. Cooper leaned toward her and said in a quiet, firm voice, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Startled, Schaffner retrieved the note from her pocket and opened it. In neat capital letters, it read, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit beside me. You are being hijacked." Schaffner, maintaining her professional composure despite her shock, sat down in the empty seat next to Cooper. He opened his briefcase just enough for her to glimpse what appeared to be wires and red cylinders inside. She would later describe it as looking like dynamite. "I want you to take this message to the captain," Cooper told her in a calm, measured voice. "I want $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills. I want 2 back parachutes and 2 front parachutes. When we land in Seattle, I want a fuel truck ready to refuel the plane. If these demands are not met, I will do the job." The way he said, "Do the job," calmly, professionally, without emotion, convinced Schaffner that this man was entirely serious. She nodded and carried the message to the cockpit. Captain William Scott read the note with alarm but maintained his composure. He immediately contacted air traffic control in Seattle to relay the hijacker's demands. From there, the information was passed to the Seattle police and the FBI. The FBI quickly assembled a team led by Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who would go on to spend much of his career investigating this case. The agency contacted the president of Northwest Orient Airlines, Donald Nyrop, who immediately authorized the $200,000 ransom payment, equivalent to about $1.3 million in today's dollars. Meanwhile, in the air, Schaffner returned to Cooper and told him the demands were being met. Cooper remained calm and polite. When Schaffner offered to stay with him to avoid arousing suspicion among the other passengers, he agreed. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he told her quietly. "I just want the money and the parachutes. This isn't personal." Throughout this initial interaction, Cooper displayed no nervousness, no hesitation, no signs of being an amateur. His demeanor was that of a man who had thought carefully about what he was doing and was executing a well-considered plan. As the aircraft approached Seattle, the crew was instructed to circle Puget Sound to give the authorities on the ground time to assemble the ransom and parachutes. Cooper seemed unbothered by the delay, ordering another bourbon and soda and paying for it, even leaving a tip. This small detail, that a hijacker in the middle of a serious crime would observe the social nicety of tipping, would later contribute to the mystique surrounding the case. For nearly 2 hours, Flight 305 circled over Puget Sound as authorities on the ground scrambled to meet Cooper's demands. Banks were contacted to assemble the cash, and parachutes were gathered from a local skydiving school and McCord Air Force Base. Inside the aircraft, most of the passengers remained unaware of the drama unfolding. They were told that a minor mechanical issue was causing the delay in landing. Cooper continued to sit quietly, occasionally making calm conversation with the flight attendants. "Where are you from?" Tina Mucklow, another flight attendant who had joined Schaffner in attending to Cooper, asked at one point. "I'm not really from anywhere," Cooper replied with a slight smile. "I don't have much of a home." When Mucklow asked if he had a grudge against Northwest Orient, Cooper shook his head. "I don't have a grudge against your airline, miss. I just have a grudge." These cryptic statements would later be analyzed by investigators and amateur sleuths alike, looking for clues to Cooper's identity and motivation. Was he a disgruntled employee of another airline? A former military man with a grievance against the government? A professional criminal executing a carefully planned heist? The ambiguity of his comments only deepened the mystery. Finally, at 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 was cleared to land at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. As the Boeing 727 descended through the rainy evening sky, Cooper issued specific instructions. The plane was to be parked in a remote, well-lit area of the tarmac. The cabin lights were to be dimmed to prevent snipers from targeting him. Only one ground crew member would approach the aircraft with the money and parachutes. The aircraft touched down and taxied to an isolated section of the tarmac as instructed. Outside, FBI agents and Seattle police had established a perimeter, but they maintained their distance as Cooper had demanded. Northwest Orient Seattle operations manager delivered the items personally, a knapsack containing the $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, the serial numbers had been microfilmed by the FBI, and 4 parachutes, 2 main chutes and 2 reserve chutes. The money weighed approximately 21 pounds. Cooper inspected the money briefly, appearing satisfied. He then examined the parachutes with what observers would later describe as professional interest, checking the ripcords and harnesses with apparent knowledge of how they functioned. With the ransom and parachutes in his possession, Cooper presented his next set of demands. He wanted the aircraft to fly to Mexico City, with a required refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. He specified particular flight conditions. The plane must remain below 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down, the wing flaps set at 15 degrees, and the cabin remaining unpressurized. To aviation experts, these requirements were telling. Flying below 10,000 feet would keep the cabin naturally pressurized, making it possible to open the rear door in flight. The specific request for the flaps at 15 degrees would slow the aircraft to about 200 miles per hour, a speed that an experienced skydiver might consider manageable for a jump. The request for the landing gear to remain down would further reduce the aircraft's speed. Cooper then allowed all passengers, Florence Schaffner, and another flight attendant to leave the aircraft. He kept the cockpit crew, Captain William Scott, First Officer William Radizak, and Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, along with Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow. As the passengers disembarked, they remained largely unaware of what had transpired. It was only when they entered the terminal and saw the assembled police and FBI agents that many learned they had been part of a hijacking. Meanwhile, Cooper and his remaining hostages prepared for the next phase of his audacious plan. At 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 took off from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with its unusual complement, the three-man cockpit crew, Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow, and the hijacker known as D.B. Cooper. The night had grown darker, and the rain had intensified. The aircraft climbed through the stormy skies and leveled off at 10,000 feet as Cooper had demanded. In the cabin, Cooper directed Mucklow to join the pilots in the cockpit and remain there with the door closed. Before she did so, he demonstrated an unexpected familiarity with the aircraft by instructing her on how to lower the rear stairs, a feature unique to the Boeing 727. "No funny stuff," Cooper warned the crew over the intercom. "Keep the door closed, and everything will be fine." With the cockpit door shut, Cooper was now alone in the passenger cabin. Outside, two F-106 fighter jets from McChord Air Force Base had been scrambled to follow the airliner, maintaining a discreet distance. A Lockheed T-33 trainer aircraft piloted by FBI agents also tracked the flight. What happened next is known only through instrument readings and subsequent investigation, as no one witnessed Cooper's actions. At approximately 8:13 p.m., as the aircraft flew through the stormy night over southwestern Washington state, a warning light in the cockpit indicated that the rear stairway had been deployed. The pilot, Captain Scott, called back to Cooper over the intercom, "Is there anything we can do for you?" There was no response. At 8:24 p.m., the crew noticed a change in air pressure, suggesting the rear door had been opened. Shortly afterward, the aircraft experienced a slight upward bounce, which investigations would later attribute to a sudden shift in weight distribution, likely the moment when Cooper jumped from the aircraft. Did D.B. Cooper survive his daring leap into the darkness? He had jumped into a severe thunderstorm with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, temperatures well below zero due to the wind chill, while wearing only a business suit and loafers. The terrain below was mountainous, densely forested, and largely uninhabited. To complicate matters further, he had jumped at night, in rain and cloud cover that would have made it impossible to see the ground and select a safe landing zone. Experienced skydivers and military parachute experts would later express serious doubts about his chances of survival. The military surplus parachute he had selected was rigid and difficult to maneuver. It was not steerable, giving him little control over his descent. If he had survived the initial jump, he would have landed in wilderness areas of southwestern Washington or northwestern Oregon, miles from roads or towns, facing hypothermia in the cold November rain. Yet despite these seemingly insurmountable challenges, the possibility that Cooper might have survived captured the public imagination. Here was a man who had committed an audacious crime in full view of the authorities, yet vanished literally into thin air. The aircraft continued its journey to Reno, landing safely at 10:15 p.m. FBI agents swarmed the plane, dusting for fingerprints and collecting evidence. They found Cooper's black clip-on tie and a mother-of-pearl tie clip, which he had removed before his jump. These items would later provide crucial DNA evidence when technology advanced enough to analyze them. The search for D.B. Cooper had begun, a search that would become one of the longest and most extensive manhunts in FBI history. As Thanksgiving Day dawned on November 25, 1971, hundreds of law enforcement personnel and military searchers were already mobilizing. The FBI, working with the Air Force and Army, tried to calculate the most likely landing zone based on the aircraft's position when Cooper jumped and the prevailing wind conditions. The search area was daunting, approximately 28 miles of dense forest, steep ravines, and rugged mountains between Ariel, Washington, and Cascade Locks, Oregon. This region, part of the Cascade Range, was one of the most challenging terrains in the country. Thick old-growth forests, undergrowth so dense in places that visibility was limited to a few feet, and steep slopes that made ground travel extremely difficult. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who had been appointed as the lead investigator, coordinated with military helicopters from the Oregon Army National Guard. They flew grid patterns over the vast search area, looking for any sign of a parachute caught in the trees or evidence of someone moving through the wilderness. On the ground, search parties consisting of FBI agents, sheriff's deputies from multiple counties, and volunteers combed through the forest. They fought their way through nearly impenetrable underbrush, scaled steep slopes, and waded through swollen streams. The search took place in near-constant rain, with temperatures in the 30s and 40s, making it miserable and dangerous work. For days, then weeks, the search continued without success. No parachute was found. No money was recovered. No body was discovered. It was as if D.B. Cooper had vanished completely. In Seattle, Portland, and other cities across the Pacific Northwest, the hijacking became the main topic of conversation. Newspapers carried front-page stories about the daring skyjacker. The Seattle Times ran the headline, "Hijacker Jumps, $200,000 Missing," while the Oregonian proclaimed, "Parachutist hijacker still missing with $200,000. The FBI established a command post at Ariel, Washington, a tiny rural community near where Cooper was believed to have landed. Ariel's Tavern became an impromptu headquarters where searchers gathered to warm up and compare notes. The annual Ariel Store Tavern D.B. Cooper Party started that very year and continued as a tradition for decades afterward. As the search stretched into December with no results, the FBI began to consider the possibility that Cooper had not survived the jump. Agent Himmelsbach theorized that Cooper's body might be buried under forest debris or hidden in one of the many waterways in the area. However, without concrete evidence, the case remained open. Meanwhile, FBI agents followed up on hundreds of tips and interviewed dozens of potential suspects. They examined the backgrounds of ex-paratroopers, former airline employees, and men with criminal histories who matched Cooper's description. None of these leads produced a viable suspect. The winter of 1971 to 1972 passed with no significant developments in the case. The spring thaw brought renewed search efforts, with the theory that evidence might be more visible after the snow melted. Again, these searches yielded no results. The FBI maintained its investigation, but as months turned into years with no breaks in the case, resources were gradually redirected to other priorities. The D.B. Cooper task force dwindled from dozens of agents to just a handful, and eventually to Agent Himmelsbach working the case almost alone. Yet the mystery of D.B. Cooper had taken root in the American imagination. He had become a folk hero to some, a daring, non-violent criminal who had outsmarted the authorities and possibly gotten away with a fortune. Songs were written about him. Books speculated about his fate. His image appeared on T-shirts with slogans like, "D.B. Cooper, where are you?" The rain continued to fall on the forests of the Pacific Northwest, potentially washing away whatever evidence might have remained of Cooper's fate. The mystery deepened with each passing season, becoming one of America's most enduring unsolved crimes. For nearly 9 years, the D.B. Cooper case remained at a standstill. The FBI had interviewed countless witnesses, investigated hundreds of potential suspects, and followed up on thousands of tips, all without conclusive results. Then, in February 1980, an extraordinary discovery breathed new life into the investigation. 8-year-old Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family along the Columbia River, about 20 miles southwest of Portland, Oregon. At a place called Tenna Bar, a sandbar along the river's north shore. Brian was digging a fire pit in the sand when he uncovered 3 packets of deteriorating $20 bills, bound together with rubber bands. Brian's parents initially thought they had found discarded play money. However, when they examined the bills more closely, they realized they were genuine currency, severely damaged by exposure to water and sand but still recognizable. They contacted local authorities, who quickly involved the FBI. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, still working the Cooper case, rushed to examine the money. The serial numbers confirmed what he had immediately suspected: these were bills from the Cooper ransom. Specifically, the recovered money amounted to $5,800 in decomposing $20 bills, all with serial numbers matching the list of ransom money. This discovery was both enlightening and perplexing. On one hand, it was the first physical evidence since the hijacking that Cooper had survived the jump long enough to lose some of the money. On the other hand, the location of the find raised more questions than it answered. Tenna Bar was approximately 20 miles downriver from where Cooper was believed to have landed. More significantly, it was several miles away from the main channel of the Columbia River, in an area that would only be underwater during specific flooding conditions. How had the money reached this location? The FBI considered several possibilities. 1. Cooper had landed in the Columbia River or one of its tributaries, perishing in the process, and the money had gradually worked its way downstream. 2. Cooper had survived the jump but lost some of the money either during the descent or afterward, and it had been carried to Tenna Bar by water currents. 3. Someone who found Cooper or his remains had deliberately placed the money at Tenna Bar. To complicate matters further, geological experts examined the layering of the sand where the money was found and concluded that the bills had been deposited in a single event, not gradually over time. This seemed to rule out the theory that the money had slowly migrated downstream bit by bit. However, the money showed significant deterioration consistent with long exposure to water and sand. The rubber bands holding the bundles together were still intact, which was surprising given that rubber typically breaks down quickly in outdoor conditions. This suggested that the money had been protected from the elements for some time before being deposited at Tenna Bar. The FBI conducted extensive hydrological studies of the Columbia River, consulting with experts from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to understand how the money might have traveled to its discovery location. These studies proved inconclusive, with no clear explanation for how the money had arrived at Tenna Bar in the condition it was found. The discovery of the money reignited public interest in the case. News programs ran special features on the D.B. Cooper mystery. Amateur sleuths developed elaborate theories to explain the money's journey. The legend of D.B. Cooper grew further, with this tangible evidence that at least some of the ransom had survived, even if Cooper himself had not. For the FBI, the money was a tantalizing clue but ultimately a frustrating one. It confirmed that they had been searching in approximately the right area, but it didn't lead them any closer to identifying Cooper or determining his fate. The investigation continued, but the mystery remained unsolved. Over the decades since the hijacking, numerous suspects have been investigated, and countless theories have been proposed about the identity and fate of D.B. Cooper. Some of these investigations were conducted officially by the FBI, while others were pursued by journalists, amateur detectives, and even family members of potential suspects. One of the earliest serious suspects was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. In April 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking. McCoy hijacked a United Airlines flight, demanding $500,000 and parachutes in a method strikingly similar to Cooper's. McCoy successfully parachuted from the aircraft over Utah and was captured 2 days later. While serving his sentence, he escaped from prison and was killed in a shootout with FBI agents in 1974. The similarities between McCoy's hijacking and Cooper's were unmistakable, leading some investigators to believe they were the same person. However, the FBI eventually ruled McCoy out as Cooper based on physical descriptions and the testimony of flight attendants who didn't identify McCoy as the hijacker they had seen. Another compelling suspect emerged in 2011 when a woman named Marla Cooper came forward claiming that her uncle, Lynn Doyle Cooper, had been D.B. Cooper. Marla stated that as a young girl, she remembered her uncle arriving at a family gathering injured on Thanksgiving 1971, claiming he had been in a car accident. She later overheard him discussing a hijacking with her other uncle. Lynn Doyle Cooper, a Korean War veteran with parachute experience, died in 1999. The FBI investigated this lead, including analyzing a DNA sample from Lynn Doyle Cooper's daughter, but the results were inconclusive. Robert W. Rackstraw, a Vietnam veteran with paratrooper training, was another prominent suspect. Rackstraw had an extensive criminal history and aviation experience, and physically resembled the composite sketches of Cooper. In 2016, a private investigative team led by documentary filmmaker Thomas Colbert publicly named Rackstraw as Cooper. The team claimed to have decoded messages in letters allegedly sent by Cooper that pointed to Rackstraw's identity. Rackstraw himself neither confirmed nor denied the allegations before his death in 2019, sometimes playfully hinting at involvement while maintaining plausible deniability. In 2007, the FBI announced a new lead involving a partial DNA profile extracted from Cooper's tie. This profile allowed them to rule out several suspects but wasn't complete enough to identify the hijacker definitively. The FBI hoped that advances in DNA technology might eventually provide a more conclusive answer. Beyond these specific suspects, broader theories have developed about Cooper's background and fate. Some investigators believe Cooper was a former military paratrooper, possibly with experience in special operations. His apparent knowledge of aircraft, parachutes, and his comfort with jumping in adverse conditions suggest military training. Others suspect he was an airline employee or had worked in the aviation industry, explaining his familiarity with the Boeing 727's rear staircase system and his detailed knowledge of flight operations. As for Cooper's fate after the jump, opinions remain divided. Many FBI agents who worked the case, including Ralph Himmelsbach, came to believe that Cooper did not survive the jump. They cite the harsh conditions, his inappropriate clothing, the non-steerable parachute, and the challenging terrain below. Others believe Cooper survived the initial jump but may have been injured and later died in the wilderness, explaining why only a portion of the money was found and why no one came forward to claim responsibility. A smaller group maintains that Cooper completely succeeded, escaping with most of the money and building a new life under a different identity. The finding of some of the ransom money at Tena Bar has spawned its own set of theories. Some experts believe the money was transported to Tena Bar during the 1974 dredging of the Columbia River and subsequent dumping of material near the discovery site. Others suggest that Cooper's body and the money traveled downstream naturally after he landed in the Lewis River, a tributary of the Columbia. There are even conspiracy theories suggesting that the money was deliberately planted at Tena Bar, either by Cooper himself as a red herring or by someone who had found Cooper's remains and kept most of the money. In 2016, the FBI officially suspended active investigation of the Norjack case, their code name for the Northwest hijacking, although they maintain that the case will remain open until it is solved. The decision to reallocate resources away from the Cooper investigation reflected the agency's assessment that, after 45 years of investigation, all viable leads had been exhausted. The rain falls steadily on the forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the truth of what happened to D.B. Cooper may still lie hidden among the towering Douglas firs and the rushing waters of the Columbia River watershed. Few unsolved crimes have captured the public imagination quite like the case of D.B. Cooper. In the decades since the hijacking, Cooper has transcended the status of a mere criminal to become an enduring American folk legend, a mysterious figure who pulled off an audacious heist and potentially escaped justice, vanishing into thin air with his identity intact. In the Pacific Northwest, Cooper's legacy is particularly strong. Each year since 1974, the town of Ariel, Washington, near the center of the original search area, has held a D.B. Cooper Days festival on the Saturday following Thanksgiving. At the Ariel store and tavern, Cooper enthusiasts gather to trade theories, display memorabilia, and raise a toast to the mysterious skyjacker. Cooper has been immortalized in popular culture in numerous ways. In music, multiple songs have been written about him, including D.B. Cooper, by Todd Snyder, The Ballad of D.B. Cooper, by Chuck Brodsky, and references in songs by Kid Rock, Dropkick Murphys, and others. In film and television, Cooper's story has been featured in documentaries like D.B. Cooper, Case Closed, and fictionalized in movies such as The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper, 1981, starring Treat Williams. His hijacking has been referenced in TV shows including Prison Break, Leverage, Justified, and Loki. In literature, dozens of books have been written about the case, ranging from serious investigative works like Skyjack, The Hunt for D.B. Cooper, by Jeffrey Gray, to novels that imagine Cooper's fate, such as Freefall, by J.T. Sawyer. Cooper has even appeared in comic books, with Marvel Comics creating a character inspired by him in the 1990s. In 2004, a Dark Horse comic series called The D.B. Cooper 4 imagined Cooper as part of a team of thieves. Beyond entertainment, Cooper has influenced American culture in subtler ways. He has become a symbol of an era when air travel was less secure and more romantic, before the rigorous security protocols that would later become standard. His hijacking led directly to significant changes in airline security, including the installation of peephole doors in cockpits and the development of the Cooper vane, a mechanical device that prevents the rear stairway of a Boeing 727 from being lowered in flight. For many Americans, Cooper represents a particular type of outlaw hero, one who committed a crime without violence, targeting a corporation rather than individuals, and disappeared without causing harm. This perception, whether accurate or not, has contributed to his mystique. Law enforcement officials have mixed feelings about Cooper's cultural status. Ralph Himmelsbach, the FBI agent who spent most of his career pursuing the case, expressed frustration in his memoir about what he saw as the glorification of a criminal. Yet even Himmelsbach acknowledged a grudging respect for the meticulous planning and execution of the hijacking. Whether Cooper survived his leap into the stormy night or perished in the attempt, his legacy is secure as one of America's most fascinating unsolved mysteries. The empty parachute bag that may still lie hidden somewhere in the forests of the Pacific Northwest has become a metaphor for unanswered questions, for possibilities that remain open, for mysteries that may never be solved. As raindrops continue to fall through the densely forested mountains where Cooper may have landed, they carry with them echoes of a story that has become larger than life, a modern American legend born on a stormy Thanksgiving Eve in 1971. As we approach the present day, the D.B. Cooper case remains officially unsolved, though the FBI formally suspended active investigation in July 2016 after 45 years of pursuit. In their statement announcing this decision, the FBI explained that they were redirecting resources to focus on more urgent criminal cases, while noting that they would consider any physical evidence of the parachutes or the money if it emerged. The decision to suspend the investigation didn't mean closure. The case file was simply moved to the FBI's inactive cases. Should compelling new evidence arise, the investigation could be reopened. Today, what remains of the recovered ransom money is preserved as evidence at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The fragmentary DNA profile extracted from Cooper's tie is still available for comparison should a promising suspect emerge. The composite sketches of Cooper, created with the help of the flight attendants and passengers who saw him, remain among the most recognizable criminal images in American history. Despite the official suspension of the investigation, private citizens continue to pursue leads and develop theories. Amateur sleuths, professional investigators, journalists, and family members of potential suspects regularly announce new findings or interpretations of existing evidence. In 2017, a group of citizen investigators calling themselves the D.B. Cooper Research Team claimed to have found remnants of parachute material at an undisclosed location in the Pacific Northwest. They submitted these materials to the FBI, though no official confirmation of their significance has been released. Scientific advancements continue to offer new possibilities for solving the case. Improvements in DNA analysis might someday allow for a more complete profile from the tie or other items Cooper touched. Geographic information systems and modern hydrological modeling provide new insights into where Cooper might have landed and how the money could have reached Tena Bar. For the flight crew members who experienced the hijacking firsthand, the case remains a defining life event. Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant who spent the most time with Cooper, left the airline industry shortly after the incident and eventually entered a convent for a period. She has rarely spoken publicly about her experience. Florence Schaffner, who first received Cooper's hijacking note, continued her career as a flight attendant but has also maintained privacy regarding the event. The Boeing 727 aircraft involved in the hijacking, with tail number N467 US, continued to fly for Northwest Orient, later Northwest Airlines, until the early 1990s. It was eventually sold to Piedmont Airlines and later retired from service. Parts of the historic aircraft were reportedly scrapped, though aviation enthusiasts have tracked some components to museums and private collections. In the forests and mountains of the Pacific Northwest, the physical evidence of Cooper's jump, if it exists, has been subjected to nearly 50 years of harsh weather, animal activity, and natural decomposition. Any parachute material would have deteriorated significantly. The remaining bundles of cash, if exposed to the elements, would likely have disintegrated beyond recognition. Yet the possibility remains that somewhere in that vast wilderness, definitive evidence still waits to be discovered, perhaps by a hiker stumbling upon weathered remnants of a parachute, or a construction project unearthing long-buried bundles of $20 bills. As another year passes, the real identity and fate of D.B. Cooper drift further into the realm of legend. Was he a skilled criminal who executed a perfect crime, or a desperate man who perished in the wilderness? Was he an experienced paratrooper making one last jump, or an aviation employee with a grudge against the industry? We may never know. Tonight, as the rain falls gently outside your window, the mystery of D.B. Cooper continues to whisper through the Douglas firs and cedars of the Pacific Northwest. Perhaps he survived and lived out his days quietly under another name. Perhaps his remains lie undiscovered, a secret kept by the dense forests. Or perhaps, as some romantics like to imagine, he's still out there somewhere, occasionally raising a glass to the perfect crime. The empty frames of the Gardner Museum and the empty parachute bag of D.B. Cooper stand as reminders of mysteries that continue to captivate us, questions without answers, stories without endings. Let the sound of the rain guide you into peaceful sleep, carrying with it the echoes of one of history's most intriguing unsolved mysteries. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.